Russia has suddenly taken quite a bit of territory north of Kharkiv, right at the border. But that's not really an offensive to take Kharkiv. This video will explain why not. We will also mention some reasoning behind current border ops. But ultimately, this video will go further and explain just what would be needed if Russia wanted to make a proper attempt at taking Kharkiv. So, stay tuned. Hey, what is this? A cute bink of plushie? Well, I guess I could use an adjutant. Come here, little fella, I'll take you home. And you too can take your own bink of adjutant.
Available at Crowdmade store.
Yep, we made a bink of plushie. If you want one for yourself or as a gift,
do check out our Crowdmade store.
The link is available below in the video description. It's not too small, not too big, perfect for your desk or your shelf next to your military history books. Or you can give it away. We've made it as low cost as humanly possible, which is very hard when you're contracting very small production runs. Well, go ahead and treat yourself. That Russia would attempt something around Kharkiv has been suggested for some weeks now. So Russia taking land north of Kharkiv isn't much of a surprise. What some saw as surprising was A, how few ready-to-react units Ukraine had in the vicinity, and B, how few fortified lines Ukraine had there. The thing is, it doesn't make sense to fortify the lines right along the border. That would put the workers at risk, and it doesn't give much warning for an incoming attack. As a defender, you want a few miles of no man's land to monitor incursions. Ukrainian fortifications seem to be farther inland. Though granted, reports suggest those fortifications are not very elaborate and may not even have enough minefields. Before the attack, Russia had an estimated 31,000 troops in Belgorod region. City of Belgorod and nearby facilities were often a target of Ukrainian attacks. The rest of the border towards Ukraine is less populated by Russian troops. Some 10 to 11,000 are thought to be positioned near the border roughly north of Sumy, with another 8 or so thousand further up north in Bryansk region, watching Ukraine's northern edge. All those are spread over hundreds of miles of border. Even the 30-something thousand troops near Belgorod can't all be engaged in offensive actions. Some are likely positioned further west, meaning east of Sumy. There are probably some in this salient northwest of Kharkiv as well. While it's plausible Russia quickly rushed in additional troops for this push, those figures can't be big, as even a few tens of thousands of additional troops would require weeks of prep time and they would get spotted earlier. So what Russia is doing now, it's using maybe 5 or so regiments worth of its maneuver troops to test out defenses north of Kharkiv. That's maybe up to 10,000 troops, with possibly a few more regiments held back to be sent where needed. Basically half or so of the Belgorod area troops. Those weren't big to begin with, and half seem to be staying put for their usual border overwatch duty. As we said, those 10 or so thousand troops may grow a bit larger in the coming days, if Russia manages to quickly haul in some extra battalions. Ukraine could not afford to man the entire border right next to Russia, so in essence the border villages were empty, and Ukraine is only now responding after it assessed the scope and direction of Russian incursion. Allegedly, Ukraine has now rushed in elements from at least 4 brigades to the area, that's possibly over 10,000 troops, to help the territorial army troops that were holding those fortified lines. But the issue is this: Russia had those give or take 30,000 troops around Belgorod for a long time. Ukraine was at times making some incursions there, and Russia decided it needed to deploy troops to that area. Ukraine's incursions were small and sporadic, using fewer troops, which means more troops were available for other parts of the front. Russia may have decided it's time to do something with those Belgorod troops. Those were there anyway, and now those seem to have redirected 3 or so of Ukraine's army brigades, drawing those away from other fights, like those in Donbass, perhaps around Chasiv Yar. We will of course see how much can Russia do in Donbass, but this sort of force redirection may complicate matters for Ukraine. If and when Russia indeed attacks across the border near Sumy, that will make the situation even harder. Another reason for Russian ops is mere probing attacks. If Russia ever wanted to move on Kharkiv proper, then probing incursions towards Ukrainian lines would be necessary to try to see where the lines are weakest. But if one expects an offensive towards Kharkiv itself, then these current Russian ops are not really it. Even for mere probing attacks, they're too limited. A much wider front would need to be probed for that, especially west of Kharkiv, not just north and east of Kharkiv as it is now. We'd likely see bigger forces used just for those probing attacks. Which leaves yet another possibility for current attacks, to simply broaden the belt under Russian control around Belgorod. That way fewer Ukrainian artillery pieces might be in range of shelling. Belgorod was shelled sporadically during 23 and 24 in response to various Russian operations. But again, to achieve such a buffer zone, a bigger operation would be needed, also going northwest of Kharkiv, and going several miles deep pretty much everywhere. So if that's the goal, then we're seeing first half of such ops, with the second half possibly making this part of the border flare up. But what about the big threat against Kharkiv? If Russia was serious about taking it, just what sort of a force would it even need to just attempt it? Before the war, Kharkiv was a city of 1.4 million people. According to Oleg Sinehubov, head of Kharkiv military administration, that figure plummeted to just 300,000 as the war started in 2022. But many people returned, and by January 2023, he says 1.1 million people were living in the city. There is no data since then, but it's plausible that the number remained similar or even crept up a bit higher until 2024. It's possible that more people have again started leaving since, but there are no reports of mass exodus from Kharkiv yet. So we're still talking about a city with 1 million people in an infrastructure for 1.4 million. Kharkiv was or is Ukraine's second biggest city, and area-wise it covers some 140 square miles. That's comparable to Detroit or Las Vegas. Of course, those two are much more dispersed with fewer large buildings. Just reaching Kharkiv in the most direct fashion would mean going over 20 miles of territory. To just half encircle it from the north, we're really talking about a 25 by 25 mile area needed for Russia. That's something like 12 times bigger area than what Russia took during April all around Donbass. Of course, that would mean Russia only approached Kharkiv. To take Kharkiv, it needs either to enter it directly and fight house to house, or to encircle it and hold it encircled until defenders run out of supplies. Both options would require a lot of time and many troops. Not encircling Kharkiv fully means fresh troops and supplies could be brought in. Russia would need both troops operating inside the city and troops protecting the flanks of the salient towards Kharkiv. Encircling Kharkiv would first require many battles around it. To take a much larger piece of territory, it would likely mean taking at least 1,300 square miles of territory, but plausibly more to have a really robust zone around it. To put that in perspective, when Russia was taking Bakhmut, it had to take roughly 100 square mile piece of territory inside the city and around the city to take it. Once it started in earnest at the end of 2022, that battle took 5 months for a city of 70,000 residents, roughly 16 square miles in area. Chief of the Russian Wagner private army himself said that 20,000 of his troops were killed in the months-long Battle of Bakhmut, of which 10,000 were prisoners, which may have been expendable to Wagner. That suggests several more tens of thousands were wounded. Western analysts put the entire number to 20,000 killed and 60 to 80,000 wounded. Now, that was a much smaller city, right next to Russian lines. Kharkiv is for now still quite away from the front line. On the other hand, Ukraine seems to have a smaller influx of fresh troops now. Russia seems to have better recon capabilities now and more precise weapons. So given all that, what might Russia need to take Kharkiv? First, it might need months to assemble far more troops. That means taking troops from other areas, which means ceasing offensive operations in the rest of Ukraine. Alternative to that is half a year or a year to get to a point where it enlists and trains hundreds of thousands of additional troops over whatever number Ukraine managed to enlist. Then it might need months to fight its way to Kharkiv and mostly encircle it. That itself might require tens of thousands of casualties, as Kharkiv is much more important for Ukraine than Bakhmut was. Ukraine is likely to throw everything behind it in order to protect it. Finally, if Russia wants to go head-on into Kharkiv, months more and probably hundreds of thousands of troops might be needed to actually take it, fighting house to house. Russia had roughly 450,000 troops inside Ukraine in total around December 2023. That may have reached 500,000 by now. To add several 100,000 more just for the Kharkiv operation, that's something far outside the scope of Russian capabilities right now. Russia today, while outclassing Ukraine in artillery, still can't hope to match artillery usage from 2022. It is using far more large guided bombs today, and those could be useful around Kharkiv, but given the size of the front around Kharkiv and size of Kharkiv itself, it would take over a year worth of Russian precision bomb production capacity, all redirected to Kharkiv, just to make a difference. And all that assumes constant superiority for Russia. If it gets bogged down, it might not be months, but a year or years just to encircle Kharkiv. The approach to Kharkiv is mostly flat, a lot of farmland, with some villages and towns alongside roads. There's a large forest to the north of Kharkiv, which would likely be fought for every tree at a time. Nowadays, countless precision weapons and drones means it's too dangerous to go across open fields, and despite urban areas and forests providing natural fortification to the defender, going through such areas may be the lesser of two evils. But such progress would be costly and long. There's a further large forest to the west and a lot of smaller forests to the south. Russia would likely need to take all those as sort of okayish natural fortifications to actually encircle Kharkiv. All roads would need to be cut. And Russia would need to endure constant Ukrainian counterattacks from 2 or 3 sides. It's plausible Russia would first want to take Kupiansk and go westward to Kharkiv for any sort of encirclement operation. That's thousands of square miles of territory more, and many more casualties, potentially comparable to casualties that a direct assault on the city would require. It's plausible that the current border ops are in a sense shaping operations to affect the Ukrainian rear defenses of the Kupiansk sector, if Russia plans to push to Kupiansk and further westward. But for as long as Ukraine is supplied with arms and ammo from the west in sufficient quantities, Russia would need a colossal effort just to encircle Kharkiv, equal to almost the entire effort it put into the war in the last year and a half. And even then it would take more time and more troops to take the city. Fully encircled city the size of Kharkiv could last for months. That's if it would not be well stocked up from before. It could last a year depending on those supply stocks. A vast number of defenders would work both for and against Ukraine. A city would be harder to take for the Russians, but also the city would need more food and other supplies. General population will likely largely flee again, making it somewhat easier to supply 100 or 200,000 defenders within the city itself. World War II siege of Leningrad at its worst lasted for a year and a half, during which it was cut off, save for some provisional roads over the frozen lake during 2 winters. That was a much larger area defended with bigger supply stocks. Stalingrad saw a German army trapped, holding out for 2 months inside the city from November 1942. A little over 300,000 troops were surrounded by a few times larger forces. Germans did not manage to stockpile much supplies, and airlift aid was fairly small. A much smaller scale example is Mariupol siege in 2022, where several thousand Ukrainian troops held for 3 months, against a few times more numerous enemy. During World War II, Kharkiv itself changed hands a few times. Some of those battles were massive. Second Battle of Kharkiv saw over 700,000 Soviet troops attacking Kharkiv. Germans then counterattacked. After 9 times greater losses, Soviets backed off. In 1943, Soviets liberated Kharkiv for good, after a massive force outnumbered German defenders. But even that took almost 10 times greater casualties. Those examples were much shorter, but one ended in attacker's defeat, and the other had a massive attacker advantage and seemingly no casualty limit. Today's city assaults may still involve a few 100,000 troops, but the prep work isn't there yet. And we want to stress just how far from current realities of the battlefield all that is. Kharkiv is not in any immediate danger. If Russia does go for it, it will have to organize such a vast operation that it would telegraph its coming for months in advance. What seems more plausible is that if Ukraine's defenses keep having to ration ammo and weapons, and if Ukraine keeps being low on freshly mobilized troops, that during the rest of the year the front line might naturally creep towards Kharkiv. Right now, ammo and weapons seem to be coming, but fresh troops, that may be harder to solve. But to actually go in and encircle the city, that's something Russia does not seem to be planning right now, nor in the coming months. We may see many other fights and Russian gains south in Donbass, and even possibly a functional peace plan signed, before Kharkiv really gets threatened. That's it for this video. We originally had Russian turtle tanks planned to come out today, but that has been postponed by a week, as Kharkiv is a more time-sensitive topic. Also, our patrons and YouTube channel members, thank you guys for all the support. We hope to make another exclusive video for you guys next month. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.